So we've been journeying through the Bible, and we're just over a month into our journey, and we're in the book of Genesis. And Genesis, along with the 4 other books that follow, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they're all written by this guy named Moses, who we haven't read about him yet. But they take us from the beginning of time, from creation, and they're going to take us through to Moses' death. And so far, we've read about a bunch of imperfect men and women, people who made mistakes. They didn't always make good choices. Sometimes we even scratch our heads reading their stories, wondering why they're included in here. But God used each of these people as part of his story. Each historical account points us to God. These pages are filled with truth and hope that it's never too late. We're never too broken. Living and breathing scripture that spurs us on to transformation. And this morning we're going to be taking a look at a guy named Jacob. Now, for most of his life, he schemed to get what he wanted. He struggled to give God the authority in his life, so he was spent a lifetime chasing a blessing rather than the one who blesses. But as we'll discover, it was one night when he comes face to face with the living God that his life was transformed. So Jacob's story is really a story of hope, that God pursues us even when we don't pursue him, that he wants a relationship with us no matter what we've done. He has promises for our lives, and he's willing to go to the mat with us, to wrestle things out with us, to allow us to get to that point of sheer exhaustion when all we can do is stop wrestling and start clinging to him. Because that's when things change. That's when our lives start to transform. So if you want, you can open your Bibles to Genesis 25. This is where Jacob's story begins. And I just want to do a little bit of an overview, because I don't think we can talk about him wrestling with God if we don't really understand what was going on in his life. And I'm not going to assume that everybody's done their reading. So I want to give you a little bit of an overview of Jacob's life. If you can put on a screen, this is, Pastor Tony showed this last week, but this is Jacob's family tree. And as you can see, Jacob is the son of Rebekah and Isaac and the grandson of Abraham. So this promise to Abraham that he's going to be the father of many generations is starting to play out. Well, he also has this twin brother named Esau. And before Jacob is even born, we're given this glimpse into his character. Because even in their mother's womb, him and his brother struggled. Like Rebekah starts to wonder what in the world is going on in there, and why is this happening? And she asks God, and he tells her this in chapter 25, verse 23. He says, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples will come from you and be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other. The older will serve the younger. So this is kind of like the first ultrasound ever recorded. We know it's 2 boys because nations would represent men, boys, and that there's 2 of them. And then we know about this prophecy that's been spoken over their life, that the youngest is going to be stronger and the older is going to serve the younger. Well, it comes time for these babies to be born, and Esau comes out first, and grasping at his brother's heel comes Jacob. That's where the name Jacob comes from. It means heel holder or supplanter. And supplanter means to supersede another by force or treachery. And we start to see Jacob live up to his name in verse 27. This is really the first big instance of Jacob manipulating to get what he wanted. So what had happened was Esau had been out hunting all day. And he comes home, he's super tired, and he's super hungry, and lo and behold, Jacob is cooking some stew on the campfire. I was going to say stove, but they wouldn't have had a stove. And Esau says, let me eat some of that red stuff. But Jacob's thinking, okay, what can I get out of this? Let's make a deal. He says, first, sell me your birthright. What the birthright was the inheritance that would go to the firstborn son, and it often meant they would get a double portion or more of the inheritance. But at this point, Esau is hangry. Like, instead of reaching for a Snickers, he was super hungry, and he says, I don't even care about my birthright. I'm dying of starvation. Just give me some of that stew. And the transaction happens, and he loses his birthright, and Jacob gets what he wanted. Well, though we start to see this pattern in Jacob's life of lying and cheating to get what he wants, chasing things instead of God. His priorities are all out of whack, and so he struggles through life. And the same thing happens to us. If we don't allow God to have his rightful place in our lives, then our priorities get out of whack. We chase wrong things. We may think that the things we're chasing are a blessing, but oftentimes they're really things that hurt us and cause a lot of problems. See, what we believe about God, who God is, what he has done, and who he says we are, directly affects how we exist and function in our world. And Jacob hasn't acknowledged God's power and presence in his life, and so it affects how he treats people and what things are important to him and the lengths he'll go to satisfy those desires, as we'll see in chapter 27. So Isaac says to Esau, "Son, I'm getting older. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be around, and I want to bless you before I die. So I want you to go out, hunt some food, prepare a meal for me, and then we'll eat together and I'll give you a blessing." Well, Rebekah, their mom, overhears this conversation, and Jacob is her favorite son. So she says, "Jacob, come here. I have a plan. I want you to go get me 2 young goats from our flock. I'll prepare a meal for your dad, and then you can take it to him, and he'll bless you instead." Jacob's a little bit concerned. I don't really know if that's the right word, but Esau's really hairy. And he says, "Well, what if dad touches me? Or what if dad tries to smell me? He's going to know I'm not Esau, and then he's going to curse me instead." Basically, she tells him, "Don't worry about it. Just do what I say." So Jacob goes and kills the goats. Rebekah prepares them. She takes some of Esau's clothes and puts them on Jacob. And then she also takes some of the skin from the goats and puts them on his neck and on his hands. Jacob takes the food to his father, who happens to have really poor eyesight, hence they're able to pull off this trickery. And he's a little surprised, like, "How did you find this so quickly?" And I thought his response in verse 20, chapter 27, verse 20, was really interesting, because he says, "Because the Lord, your God, made it happen for me." This statement only proves further Jacob's either ignorance or unwillingness to acknowledge who God is. God didn't help him find that food. That was an outright lie so that he could get what he wanted. Now, Isaac tries to confirm several times whether or not this is his son Jacob that he's talking to. But Jacob and his mother had done such a good job disguising him that Isaac ends up blessing him instead. And as soon as Isaac is finished giving Jacob the blessing and he leaves, in comes Esau, only to find out what had just happened. And he's angry. And in verse 36, he says this, "Isn't he rightly named Jacob? For he has cheated me twice now. He took my birthright, and look, now he's taken my blessing." So Esau decides he's going to kill his brother, because, we always go to that level. It's never just something small. I only pushed my brother out of a treehouse once. Didn't kill him. Anyway, the only thing that Jacob can do is run away from the problem, from the mess that he just created. So he heads off to his uncle's house, because his parents say, "Go to your uncle's house to find a wife." And there he encounters God for the first time. He lays down and has this dream, and there's a stairway leading up to heaven. And on this stairway are these angels moving up and down. And the Lord appears to him, and he introduces himself to Jacob, and he says, "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac." And then he makes these promises to Jacob. The same promise that was given to Abraham, the same promise that was reiterated to his father Isaac, he gives to Jacob. "I'm going to give you land. You're going to have many descendants. They're going to spread all over the earth. I'm going to be with you, and I won't leave you until this promise is fulfilled." And that dream starts to stir something in Jacob, and he says this in verse 16. "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it." He was afraid and said, "What an awesome place this is." And then in verse 20 he says, "If God be with me and watch over me during this journey I'm making, and if he provides me with food to eat and clothing to wear, and if I return safely to my father's family, then the Lord will be my God." So this dude who's just stolen a birthright, stolen a blessing, is running away from his problems, was just given these amazing promises by God. But here we go again. Let's make a deal. If you do this, then I'll do that. You hear that Kenny Rogers song playing in your head, know when to hold 'em, know when to fold 'em. How about know when to know who you're dealing with and get it together? There's a misunderstanding of who God is and what he can do. He doesn't understand or receive or even believe God's promises. Well, Jacob continues to his uncle's house where he meets and instantly falls in love with his cousin. That was a thing back then. He ends up staying around and working for his uncle Laban. And Laban comes to him after a month and he says, "What would you like in return for your work?" And he says, "Well, I'd really like to marry Rachel, and I'll work for you for another 7 years for your daughter Rachel." And Laban agrees. 7 years come and go, and they fly by because Jacob is smitten. And it's time for the wedding. And this is where it gets interesting, because the scammer is about to get scammed. Laban disguises his daughter Leah. He puts a veil on her. And so they go through the whole wedding, and then the next morning after the wedding, Jacob wakes up and realizes who he's married, which, again, don't ask questions. I don't want to know. He didn't realize that it was Leah he had married, and he goes to his father-in-law and says, "What have you done? Didn't I work for all these years for your daughter Rachel?" And Laban says, "Well, it was the oldest daughter who has to get married first, but if you just continue working another 7 years, finish this week of wedding celebration and work for another 7 years, then I'll give you my daughter Rachel." It's interesting, because didn't he just play a similar trick on his father, disguising himself to get what he wanted? Well, there begins to be this tension within these marriages, because marrying two people and marrying sisters is a fabulous idea. And Leah is able to have babies. Rachel cannot have babies. And Rachel goes to Jacob and she says, "Give me children, give me sons, or I'm going to die." And just like he responded to his dad, he has a similar response to his wife. "It's God who's withheld children from you. Don't blame me, blame God." Jacob seems to use God's name when it's convenient. Now, despite Jacob's selfishness and previous deceptions, God blesses Jacob. He has 2 wives, 2 slave wives, 11 sons, and he's helped Laban to become really wealthy, but he wants to go home. But Laban doesn't want him to leave because he's making him rich. And so again, here we go again. Let's strike up a deal, each trying to manipulate the other in the process. Jacob says, "I'll keep watching over your flocks for as long as you give me all the speckled, spotted, and dark sheep, because they're not as wanted as the white sheep." So Laban agrees, but trying to gain the upper hand, he takes all the speckled, spotted, and dark sheep, sends them away with his sons, and gives Jacob all the white sheep. Well, then Jacob decides to practice some sort of folklore breeding plan with branches and troughs and yada, yada, yada. And from this herd of white sheep, he ends up with all these speckled, spotted, and dark sheep. See, it wasn't some divination or superstition or scientific method that allowed this to happen to Jacob. It was God. The promise from God is unfolding, and God is causing him to be successful and to prosper. But Jacob still hasn't acknowledged God's power or presence in his life. He is still not his God. He's the God of his father, Abraham, and the God of his father, Isaac. But God says to Jacob, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I'll be with you." So he packs up his family and all his possessions, and he leaves to go back home. And after a few days, Laban realizes what happened, and he goes to take off after him. But during that travel, God tells Laban, "Watch yourself. Don't say anything to Jacob, good or bad." And Laban finally catches up with Jacob, and he confronts him, "Why did you flee? Why did you deceive me? I could have harmed you for, doing what you did. But guess what? The God of your father spoke to me last night, and he told me not to say anything to you, good or bad." And then in chapter 1, Jacob goes on this tirade in verse 36. "I've been with you for 20 years, and I've done this for you, and I've done that for you, and I served you for 14 years for my wives, and I served you another 6 years for all these flocks, and you've changed my wages 10 times. But then in verse 42, he says this: "If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac had not been with me, certainly now you would have sent me off empty-handed. But God has seen my affliction and my hard work and has issued his verdict last night." See, there's this awareness that God has his hand in his situation, but he still just doesn't get it. Laban and Jacob eventually make peace. Laban sends him on his way, and this presents a bit of an issue because he's going to run into his brother Esau, and he hasn't forgotten that his brother Esau wants to kill him. So what Jacob does, trying to get ahead of the situation, is he sends these messengers ahead to Esau's camp. And then the messengers come back and tell Jacob Esau has 400 men. This is alarming. So Jacob divides all his things and people into 2 camps. So that way if Esau attacks one, the other will be safe. And he has this prayer in chapter 32, starting in verse 9. He says this, "Then Jacob said, God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, go back to your land and to your family, and I will cause you to prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. Indeed, I crossed over the Jordan with my staff, and now I've become 2 camps. Please rescue me from my brother Esau, for I am afraid of him. Otherwise, he may come and attack me, the mothers and their children. You said I will cause you to prosper, and I will make your offspring like the sand of the sea, too numerous to be counted." Jacob has these 2 big realizations in this moment. The first is, it's God, the God of his father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. You've been there with me all this time. You allowed me to prosper. You kept me safe. You've been kind and faithful to me. You've kept your promises to me. And the second realization he had is that I am unworthy. This is the first time that Jacob acknowledges that all the things, the good stuff that's been happening to him, is not from his own strength. It's been from God, and he doesn't deserve any of it. See, he had spent years of his life trying to circumvent God's blessing. He wanted it so badly that he couldn't see it was right in front of him the whole time. And these realizations lead into what will be a life-transforming moment for Jacob. He gathers a gift together for Esau, like lions and tigers and bears and sheep and goats, and he sends them and his wives and all his possessions and all his sons across the stream. And he is left alone, and it's the night before he is going to see his brother again, and he isn't sure of the outcome. He's alone, and it's nighttime, and he's afraid. I'm sure Jacob knew he'd messed up. He can look back over his life and see how he treated people and the things that he did to get what he wanted. And I'm sure the regrets were swirling in his head, the questions of what if I just would have done this, or what if I would have done that differently. And I feel like that's when we struggle the hardest. In the middle of the night, when we're afraid and we're alone with only our thoughts. Life, death, what does it all mean? Why am I here? What is my purpose? What if I just would have done this differently or said that differently? You know, those things that we made a priority and that we sacrificed our integrity for or our families for, money, cars, jobs, relationships, addictions, pride, power, status, stuff. It all just seems so trifling and silly when we come face to face with eternity. But then in verse 24, this happens. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw he could not defeat him, he struck Jacob's hip socket as they wrestled and dislocated his hip. Then he said to Jacob, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." "What is your name?" the man asked. "Jacob," he replied. "Your name will no longer be Jacob," he said. "It will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he answered, "Why do you ask my name?" And he blessed them there. Jacob then named the place Peniel, "For I have seen God face to face," he said, "yet my life has been spared." The sun shone on him as he passed by Peniel. In my Bible, the title of this portion of Scripture is Jacob Wrestles with God. But rather it seems God had come to wrestle with Jacob. A physical, in-the-flesh Lord had lowered himself to come down and wrestle it out with his child. Because despite Jacob's flaws and despite his imperfections and all the stuff he had done, God loved Jacob. He had a plan and a purpose for him and promises for him, and he'd been pursuing a relationship with him all his life, and all he wanted was Jacob's heart. But even here, Jacob isn't willing to immediately surrender. So the struggle continues through the night. Jacob wrestles with God, which is something that he had done most of his life. He struggled with the authority of God. He struggled to know where God belonged in his life. He struggled with God's trustworthiness. He struggled with God's faithfulness to him. He wrestled with disbelief in the promises of God. So he chased the wrong thing. He chased the blessing rather than the one who blesses. And over again, he had tried to attain this blessing in his own strength, and he even sacrificed his integrity to get it. He manipulated, he lied, he cheated to get what he wanted and thought he deserved, and now here he is. The liar had been lied to, the cheater had been cheated, the player got played. But God comes to wrestle with Jacob, to work it out with him, to challenge him to change his thinking and put God in his rightful place in his life. And it's when God strikes Jacob's hip that something changes. And as I was studying this passage, and he says, let me go for its daybreak, but Jacob said, I won't let you go unless you bless me. I read it as a demand. I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. But then I looked in Hosea, and it says this in Hosea 12, 3-4. It says, in the womb he grasped his brother's heel, and as an adult he wrestled with God. Jacob struggled with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. See, it wasn't that Jacob was demanding a blessing. Rather, he is a broken man, recognizing his weakness and desperately clinging to God. Jacob didn't win this match in the sense that he was stronger or he defeated the Lord. He prevailed, he won, because he finally surrendered. I give up, Lord. I am done running. I am done trying to do it all myself because my way ain't working. And Jacob names this place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared. Jacob had come face to face with the living God, and his life was forever changed. The first thing that changed is that through his surrender, God finally took his rightful place in his life. Because as we will read from here on out, Jacob refers to him as his God, the God of my father Abraham, the God of my father Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He wasn't just his grandfather and father's God anymore. He wasn't just a scapegoat to blame for why his wife couldn't have children. He wasn't a means to an end to get the birthright that wasn't his. He wasn't what he could do for Jacob anymore. He was God, his God, worthy of surrender and worthy of his whole heart. The second thing that happened was that Jacob got a new name. See, Jacob started that wrestling match that night as heel holder, supplanter, someone who takes what they want no matter how they need to go about getting it. But he left as Israel, one who had wrestled with God and prevailed. And the third thing that happened is that he left with a physical reminder. He left with a limp. It was a reminder, though, that he wasn't who he used to be. It was a reminder that he had to rely on God. It was an outward sign of an inward transformation, a living, breathing testimony, because you can be sure that everybody he ran into after that would say, well, how'd you get that limp? And he could tell them, I came face to face with the living God, and I lived. See, God pursues us. He wants a relationship with us, no matter how many times we've messed up, how badly we've messed up. And so he will come and he will wrestle with you. And he will go rounds and rounds and rounds until you finally get to that place of brokenness. When you have tried everything else and you're at the end of your rope and you stop wrestling and trying to win and instead start clinging to God, that's when the change begins. When you come face to face with God and recognize his power, his authority, how incredibly deep his love is for you, and you tap out, the first thing that he does is he gives you a new name, a new identity. You're no longer liar, cheater, manipulator, adulterer, worthless, perfectionist, addict, depressed, stupid, loser, anxious, obsessed, or any other name that someone gave you trying to hurt you or you just bestowed upon yourself in shame. See, those names aren't in God's vocabulary. He calls you valuable and chosen and redeemed and beloved and son and daughter and fearfully and wonderfully made and created with a purpose. And he has big plans and promises for each of you. And when you get that new name and you get that new identity, you get a new outlook on life. because you stop chasing the wrong things and you start pursuing the pursuer and the good things that he wants for you. Now, like Jacob, you might come off the mat with a limp. That limp reminds us, though, that we have to, or that we can, rely on God for everything. From the moment we wake up in the morning until our head hits the pillow at night, God's got you. He's fighting your battles. He's the victor. He is healer. He's provider. He's protector. You don't have to worry about it. 2 Corinthians 12, 9 through 10 says this, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Therefore I will boast most gladly all the more about my weakness, so that Christ's power may reside in me. So I take pleasure in weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong." We don't have to be Hulk. We don't have to hide behind a mask when we're not okay. Because that limp reminds us that in our weakness, he is strong. In our inabilities, he is able. In our regrets, he is restoration. In our failures and flaws, he is perfection. In our rejection and worthlessness, he is love. And that limp is a testimony. It's a visible sign that God uses the broken and that he wants to use each of us for his glory and his story. The encouragement that we can take from Jacob's story is this, that when you come face to face with the living God, the master architect, the Alpha Omega, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the one who knows every detail about you down to how many hairs on your head, and when you start resting in what he has done for you, allowing his son to be mocked and beat and spit and nailed to a cross because he loves you, when you stop wrestling with him and start clinging to him, your life will never be the same.